All right, welcome back for our second deep dive.
Second deep dive, yeah.
We're going to jump right into a really interesting legal puzzle. Imagine this. You have a marriage, but the law considers it to have never existed in the first place.
Never happened.
That's right. Legally, it just never happened. We call this a void marriage, and it falls under the Hindu Marriage Act.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the big question for us today is, can a woman in a void marriage, so legally it never existed,
Okay.
can she still claim maintenance? It seems a little contradictory, right?
Yeah, it does. It does. It seems like, if the law says it never happened, how can there be any responsibility, right?
Exactly, yeah. Where do these responsibilities come from if the marriage is, quote, non-existent?
Right.
Luckily, we've got a recent Supreme Court decision that really clears this up. I mean, this is huge. It really clarifies a lot.
It does, yeah, big time. And it really kind of puts an end to a lot of conflicting interpretations that were out there.
Totally.
So this is a definitive answer on the matter.
Yeah, so I think before we get to what the Supreme Court actually said, it might be helpful to take a step back and define what makes a marriage void under the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955.
Yeah.
What are those, legal oops moments that just make a marriage invalid right from the start?
Yeah, the so-called void ab initio, as it's known.
Void ab initio.
Right from the beginning, it was never a valid marriage.
Okay.
So Section 11 of the Hindu Marriage Act, that's where they spell out these specific reasons, the grounds, as to why a marriage can be declared void,
Yeah.
right from the get-go.
Okay.
And there are three main ones. The first one is if one of the people getting married already has a living spouse.
Okay, so bigamy.
Bigamy, right.
Yep.
You simply cannot be legally married to two people at the same time.
Makes sense.
So that's a very, very clear one.
Okay, so that's one. What's number two?
Number two is when the couple falls within what the law calls prohibited degrees of relationship. So these are close blood ties or family ties. It's basically the law drawing a line and saying, these relationships are too close for marriage.
Okay, so certain relatives then.
Right. You can't marry your
Right.
siblings, your parents, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got bigamy, we've got certain relatives. What's the third condition that makes a marriage void?
The third one is if the two individuals are subpoena of each other.
Subpoena.
Subpoena. And this is a term that refers to being related by blood.
Okay.
Or through a common ancestor. So within a certain number of generations,
Okay.
going back. So, you might be distantly related and you might not even know it.
Yeah.
But if you fall within that category of subpoena, then that marriage is also considered void from the beginning.
Okay, so in all these cases, the marriage was never, legally speaking, was never valid.
Correct. Never legally came into being.
So that brings us back to our head scratcher. How can you, if it was never valid, how can you be responsible to financially support the other person?
That's a great question.
And let's start with permanent alimony.
Okay.
And I believe that falls under Section 25 of the Hindu Marriage Act.
It does, yeah. Section 25 deals with the provision of permanent alimony and maintenance
Okay.
that a court can order at the time of passing any decree relating to matrimonial issues.
Oh, right.
And sometimes afterwards.
Okay.
So in this case, the case that we're kind of basing this discussion around is Sukhdev Singh v. Sukhbir Kaur.
Okay.
And basically the husband's argument was exactly what you said. He was saying, look, this marriage was void.
Mm-hmm.
It was legally non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, his former partner should not be able to claim any permanent maintenance under Section 25.
Right.
His view was that Section 25 should only apply
Okay.
when a valid marriage ends in divorce.
Okay, so that seems to make sense on the surface.
Yeah.
What did the Supreme Court have to say about that?
So the Supreme Court kind of took a wider view,
Okay.
and they focused very specifically on the wording of Section 25(1). And it states that the court can order either the wife or the husband to pay alimony at the time of passing any decree.
Any decree.
Any decree.
Yeah.
And so those words, any decree, became very important to the court because they reasoned that must include a decree of nullity,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is basically the court saying, hey, this marriage was void right from the start.
So even though the marriage was never valid, issuing this decree of nullity allows for one spouse to claim permanent alimony.
Exactly. So even though the court is basically saying, hey, this never happened legally,
Uh-huh.
the very act of making that declaration
Okay.
by issuing the decree of nullity
Right.
opens up the possibility for them to then claim
Close.
permanent alimony.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And the Supreme Court really emphasized that when the legislature was drafting Section 25(1), they didn't differentiate between a decree of divorce, which ends a valid marriage,
Right.
and a decree declaring a marriage null and void, which confirms it was never valid. So to quote them directly, they say, while enacting Section 25(1), the legislature has made no distinction between a decree of divorce and a decree declaring marriage as a nullity. Therefore, on a plain reading of Section 25(1), it will not be possible to exclude a decree of nullity under Section 11 from the purview of Section 25(1) of the 1955 Act.
So the legal pathway exists.
Pathway exists, yeah.
For someone in a void marriage to claim permanent alimony. But it's not. Is it automatic?
No, not at all. The Supreme Court was very, very clear on that point.
Yeah.
So while this ruling establishes the right to make the claim, the actual granting of permanent alimony is entirely at the court's discretion. And it's going to depend heavily on the specific facts and circumstances of each individual case.
So, like, who was aware that the marriage was void in the first place? What are the financial situations of the people? And I imagine, how they behaved in the relationship.
All of those factors come into play. So the court really stressed that fairness and equitable considerations are paramount when deciding on maintenance under Section 25. And particularly the conduct of the person seeking maintenance is relevant. For instance, if a wife concealed the fact that she was already married, leading to the second marriage being void because of bigamy, well, that conduct could certainly weigh against her when the court considers her claim for alimony. They want to ensure a jest.
So it's about being fair.
It's about being fair, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about during the time when this process is going on? Can a spouse in a marriage that is potentially void seek support during that period? Like, I don't know, is there a term for that? Temporary?
So we call that interim maintenance.
Interim maintenance.
And that falls under Section 24 of the Hindu Marriage Act. So Section 24 deals with interim maintenance, which is basically financial support that's provided while the legal case is being decided. And the Supreme Court has clarified that even if a court initially, believes that there's a strong case that the marriage is void or even voidable, it still has the authority to grant this interim maintenance to a spouse while the matter is being resolved in court.
Wow. So even before a final judgment,
exactly,
they can get this support.
They can apply for it, and the court can grant it. Absolutely.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. But again, just as with permanent alimony, the granting of interim maintenance under Section 24, it's also discretionary. The court will take into account the conduct of the person applying for this temporary support. And the court has to be satisfied that the person seeking the maintenance doesn't have sufficient independent income to support themselves and to cover the costs of the legal proceedings.
Because those can be very costly.
Absolutely.
And again, the conduct of the person seeking this interim support would be considered.
Absolutely, yeah. Conduct is key throughout this whole process. And to quote the Supreme Court on this point, they say that even if a court comes to a prima facie conclusion that the marriage between the parties is void or voidable, pending the final disposal of the proceeding under the 1955 Act, the court is not precluded from granting maintenance pendente lite, provided the conditions mentioned in Section 24 are satisfied. So, yeah, the possibility of getting financial help during the legal process exists even in situations where the marriage is questionable right from the start.
So it sounds like this ruling has really brought a lot more clarity.
Absolutely.
I mean, you mentioned that there was kind of conflicting opinions on this before.
Yeah, there was before the Sukhdev Singh decision, there was inconsistency in judgments from different courts and even within the Supreme Court itself over time. Some earlier rulings had actually denied maintenance in void marriages precisely because they were considered to have no legal standing whatsoever. So this really provides that definitive stance now and resolves all that ambiguity.
And this is really important when it comes to protecting financial rights.
It is.
Especially for women who may be, in these void marriages without realizing it. And otherwise could be left with no support.
Absolutely. Imagine, someone enters into a marriage and they're not aware that their spouse already has a living partner. Well, that second marriage is void from the beginning.
Uh-huh.
But this ruling ensures that that person isn't automatically prevented from seeking financial assistance
Right.
simply because the marriage was technically never legal.
Right. Okay.
So it's a very significant development in terms of protecting
Uh-huh.
those who are vulnerable.
Okay, so to be clear though, even though there's this ruling, it's not necessarily an automatic,
It's not an entitlement.
entitlement.
Right.
The court still has the final say.
Absolutely. The court retains the discretion to decide whether to grant the maintenance, and if so, how much,
Okay.
Taking into account all the specific details of the case, the financial circumstances of both individuals involved, their conduct throughout the relationship during the proceedings, all of that
Right.
comes into play.
Okay.
So it's not a guarantee,
Yeah.
but it establishes the right to ask for that relief.
Okay. Now, the Supreme Court also referred to some earlier cases to support their reasoning on this.
And they did, yeah. They mentioned some cases such as Chandawan and Ramachandra Rampratapti Daga.
Uh-huh.
And in those cases, the court had already adopted a pretty broad interpretation of any decree in Section 25, stating that it includes various kinds of decrees under the Hindu Marriage Act, not just, decrees for judicial separation or divorce.
Right.
So this existing legal interpretation really provided a foundation for the court's reasoning in the current ruling.
Okay.
Because it reinforced the idea that the legislature really intended the maintenance provisions to have a wide scope when a marital relationship is legally altered or dissolved by a court order.
Okay, now, I think there's another case that comes up a lot in this discussion, and that's the Yamunabai Anantrao Adhuff case.
Yes.
Now, how does this case fit in?
Right.
Because it seemed to suggest something different.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction to understand. So Yamunabai and Anantrao Adhuff, that case established that a spouse of a void marriage cannot claim maintenance under a different section of the law.
Okay.
This is Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code.
Okay, CRPC.
The CRPC.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court, in the Sukhdev Singh ruling, specifically clarified that the remedies available under Section 25 of the Hindu Marriage Act and Section 125 of the CRTC are distinct.
Okay.
They operate under different principles. They have different objectives.
Gotcha.
Right. Section 25 of the HMA is really focused on addressing the financial needs of spouses
Okay.
within the context of matrimonial law.
Uh-huh.
And it's important to note, it's available to both husbands and wives.
Okay.
Now, 125 CRPC, that has a broader aim
Okay.
of preventing destitution. And it can include wives, children, and parents.
Okay.
But the definition of wife
Right.
under that section
Right.
has been interpreted more narrowly in relation to void marriages.
Okay.
So essentially what they were saying was that the Yamunabai ruling, it doesn't actually contradict the current understanding of Section 25 of the HMA.
Gotcha. So someone might be eligible under one
Exactly.
and not under the other.
Precisely. Because we're talking about different laws
Okay.
with different objectives and different interpretations.
Yep. And different relationships within those
Absolutely.
legal framework.
Exactly. So the Hindu Marriage Act is really designed to deal with the legal consequences arising from a relationship that was intended to be a marriage under that law, even if it is subsequently found to be void.
Okay, so to bring this all together for our listeners, what is the key takeaway from this deep dive?
Okay, so the central message here is that even if a marriage is legally void from its inception due to, reasons like bigamy or prohibited degrees of relationship, a spouse, and this often provides crucial protection for women, still has the legal right to seek both permanent alimony and interim maintenance under Sections 25 and 24 of the Act, respectively.
But as we said, it's not guaranteed, right? Right. The court has the final say.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The court retains that discretion to decide whether to grant the main, and if so, how much, taking into account the specifics of the case, the financial circumstances, and the conduct of everyone involved.
Right.
So this ruling, it really establishes the right to ask for that relief.
Okay.
Even when the marriage was never legally valid in the first place.
So this is, it's interesting because you're talking about financial security in these relationships that aren't even legally, they don't exist.
Right.
It makes you wonder about, how our understanding of responsibility within marriage
Yeah.
and the law's role
Mhm.
in safeguarding individuals,
Absolutely.
evolving,
Yeah.
beyond the strict legal definition
Right.
of a valid marriage.
It's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, where's that balance between, you know, the letter of the law and
Yeah.
social
And
justice?
fairness and
Yeah.
making sure that people aren't left
Right.
high and dry.
In really difficult situations.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's, it's a testament to the fact that the law is constantly adapting
Uh-huh.
to address the complexities of real life.
Yeah.
And to make sure that vulnerable individuals are not left without any recourse.
Right.
Even in these what might seem like clear-cut
Right.
legal
That's
scenarios.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for this deep dive, but it's certainly given all of us, and me especially,
Right.
a lot to think about. And I'm sure our listeners are going to be thinking about this one for quite some time.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's
Mm.
a fascinating area of law.
Yeah. So until next time,
Until next time,
thanks for listening,
thanks for having me.
and we'll see you on our next deep dive into the law.
Sounds good.